Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt di Camillo, the curator of fine art and American ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any time during today's presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you'll have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Today, we will delve into a fresh perspective on North American history during the antebellum period as seen through the eyes of the renowned British statesman, the 14th Earl of Derby. This amazing man's journey across the United States and Canada in the early 19th century gave him a unique perspective that helped to form one of the leading visionaries and reformers of the Victorian age. What Lord Derby saw and experienced on these travels had a huge impact on his later ministries as Chief Secretary to Ireland, Colonial Secretary, and 3 times Prime Minister to Queen Victoria. I would like to thank Leslie Holmes for her generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. We could not do this series without supporters like her. Caroline, Countess of Derby, studied history and art history at the University of London and worked for the Royal Collection as an assistant curator and was an exhibitions assistant to the surveyor of the late Queen's pictures. Lady Derby has spent the past 30 years working on the restoration of Knowsley Hall, the ancestral seat of the Derby family. Her myriad experiences have convinced her of the ability of education to change lives, which led to the 2023 launch of her podcast that focuses on studying history and sharing stories. Her most recent book is A North American Tour Journal, 1824-1825, The Making of a Prime Minister, which will be released later this month, actually next month, in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Lady Derby.
Well, thank you so much, Curt. It's such an honor to be on your webinar. I've listened to a few and I found them completely fascinating, and I'm very humbled that you've included me in your roster. And also to give me the opportunity to talk about this really sensational journal that we found. Our curator, Dr. Stephen Lloyd, found it just before COVID. And we immediately knew how exciting and important it was because, and this is the strapline of the book, he said, he wrote in his diaries, we might even in time perhaps have a black president. And he wrote that in 1824 as a young man. And in those days, that was really, really liberal thinking. So I've been married for 30 years. I'm married to the 19th Earl of Derby. And the man we're talking about is the 14th Earl of Derby, to give you an idea of the context of the length of the family service. This book was privately published in 1930, but with no index and no appendix and no illustrations. And it was privately published by the 17th Earl, so that was the 14th Earl's grandson. And he published it in order to give it as gifts when he went over to the Kentucky Derby, which is how you folks pronounce it, but our family in England call it Derby, that's our name. And he published 50 copies to give to his hosts when he came to the Kentucky Derby. And one went to the president, one went to the Wideners in Philadelphia, one went to the Woodwards in New York. And it was like a box of chocolates. It was a coming to stay gift. But then this is really the man himself. This is a picture of him at 24 on his gap year. So really these journals are the story of his gap year. They're in his own words. People keep on saying to me, I've written a book. I haven't written a book. I've just found a book and published it. And I'm talking about it because I really think it's important to modern day life, because he has this curiosity and empathy and humanity that I think anybody from the Pope down to my children can use as an aspiration to make your world a better place in your lifetime and be a better person. So he came to America in 1824. He was one of the most high-profile and aristocratic people to visit the USA after the American Revolutionary War in 1776, and also after the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is never taught in English schools on their history syllabus, which is, I always found extraordinary. And when I was delving into this book, I thought, God, this is really important. He went to America just after another war. So the Derby family history, it's very, very hard to talk about 19 generations in an hour long. And basically 1 to 19, they've really been intertwined with the history of England and, well, the United Kingdom. They've always had very strong connections with the monarchs. Even the first Countess of Derby, she was mother to King Henry VII. And then the fourth, fifth, and sixth Earl, they were patrons of Shakespeare. The seventh Earl, he lost his head to Thomas Cromwell for supporting the monarchy. So there's always been this tremendous loyalty to the monarchs of the time. Then, of course, there's the 12th Earl, who was the grandfather of the man we're talking about. He was the person who actually started the Derby race, the Derby, which was in 1780 in England. I know it was in 1875 in America. And then the 13th Earl, he was a tremendous natural historian, really the David Attenborough of his time. And he was a scientist, largely wanting to catalogue all the animals that he had around the house. And he had hundreds of thousands of animals around the house, but he also employed artists like Gould, Sydenham Edwards, Bartram, Audubon came, but we don't have any here, and of course Edward Lear. And all these artists were employed as scientists to actually illustrate his book. And so the 14th Earl, he was known as Edward Stanley then, because every heir is called Edward Stanley, including my son, Lord Stanley. He grew up with this tremendous legacy. He knew who he was, and he knew how important the family was. He was also an extraordinary early feminist. Women were very important in his life. He was particularly close to his mother, who he had a very shared, strong faith with. She was evangelical about the scriptures, and that gave him his moral compass. His step-grandmother was a very famous actress called Eliza Farren, and for our American listeners, there's a beautiful portrait in the Met of Eliza Farren by Thomas Lawrence, and that was his step-grandmother, and she taught him public speaking, so that when he was 4 years old, he was sort of plunked on our dining room table and was reciting great reams of Shakespeare, even though he couldn't really say his R's. He was a very, very prodigiously clever child. And because of that, he was nurtured by his step-grandmother, because his mother died when he was 18. So he's a very early feminist as well, which was important for what he later became. So when he came to America, this is the journey he took. He allegedly traveled 4,000 miles on this extensive tour, and it covered most of the East Coast down to South Carolina and up to the top of Canada. Well, not the very top. And he took in Kentucky, the Mississippi. And what's unusual about this travel journal is just how vivid it is. You know, it's an absolutely tantalizingly eyewitness report of what he saw and what America was like then. And as far as I know, there aren't many journals written about that time, and certainly not somebody who was descriptive and as poetic as he was. He wrote poetry in 5 languages from the age of 8, and he wrote them in Latin, Greek, German, French, Italian, and English, so 6 languages. And his poems are extraordinary. So because he was a poet and an artist too, these journals are very, very graphic. So he wrote in these journals in 1825, and our American listeners will obviously know about Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote his journal in 1830, but published it a bit later. And from talking to colleagues in America, a lot of people are very familiar with democracy in America. Their roots were very similar, and they shared a lot of views together. They were open-minded and positive. At a time, so Alexis de Tocqueville was French and had, you know, the French obviously fought on the side of the Americans in the Revolutionary War, and the British obviously lost the American Revolutionary War. So there was an antagonism between Britain and America at the time, and it was called the Paper Wars because it was negative. British commentators were negative about America and vice versa. And the interesting thing about Derby, Stanley as he was then, was that he was very liberal, and a lot of the journals that were written later were by radicals, so people like Fanny Trollope, Harriet Martineau, and Elizabeth Fry. But Stanley was a conservative, but he wrote positively, and I really do feel that this journal is my family's gift to present day America, because it is so positive. A later prime minister writes, "This country is a very important country. The British Empire has lots of lessons to learn from this young country, which has a very advanced democracy." So these very innocuous looking notebooks are in fact the 5 notebooks that went with the journal that we found. And these hadn't been seen before because they were his notebooks, which give colour and context to what he actually wrote in the journal. And from reading these, we learned so much more. He has conversations with enslaved people, and he asked them how they are. He asked them if they worked overtime, would they get extra money? You know, he asked them about the conditions they're living in. He gives his very personal views on things, and these notebooks are gold dust to understand what's actually in his journal itself. And we've included them in the appendix. So we've done a sort of proper job. You can either dip into this book and read it because it's a lovely, vivid travel journal. But if you really want to put the whole book into context and learn about the commerciality of slavery, for instance, he scribbles in the back of one of these notebooks just how much it costs for an enslaved person to be bought and sold, and also how much it costs to keep them. So he's very, very interested at the age of 24 in human beings. So this is the family home. It's a bit of a white elephant, shall we say, because it's huge. And when I came here in 1995, it really was unrestored. And that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years, is restoring it and opening up cupboards. And there are a lot of cupboards, obviously, in a house that big. And I found all sorts of things like the Bosworth horn, or 600 Roman coins, or these diaries. And the list goes on. And that's what's in my podcast. This house didn't used to be the main family home. It used to be a hunting lodge. And you can see at the far back of it, the early Tudor bit. And then every earl after that, with their ego and their wallet, they put on a wing here, or a chapel there, or a turret here. And then it was homogenized by my husband's uncle, and most of the Georgian bit left. But it looks as if it's a little bit truncated on the far right, because one wing was taken down in 1956. So when we were doing the research into these diaries, we were looking for a lot of background material, and we found all sorts of letters that went with it, and that really made so much difference. So this is an early letter from Edward Stanley to his father, and what you can see from this, so this is when he lands in New York, sort of saying, like you texting to your parents, landed New York. This is him saying he's landed. And it would have taken at least, well, the voyage was 37 days over, so it would have taken a while for this letter to get back. But you can see how scrawly the handwriting is. And I couldn't actually read it when we first got these journals out. So I had a wonderful colleague in America called Lisa Francavilla, and she could read this script like other people can read French and English. And she has co-edited it with me and been hugely helpful. We know that he was in fact considering publishing the journal, and he made revisions on the journey home. And all those letters have shown us that, he decided that he was going to publish them. And then in the end, he decided not to, because he thought it would be unwise. So when he went to America, he traveled with these three friends. They were all members of Parliament, and they were all his age. Two of them had been at Eton with him, and one was a Wykehamist. But they'd all been at Oxford with him, and they'd all gone to Christchurch in Oxford, where, they were, like normal undergraduates, but then they became members of Parliament, because you could only have a vote at that time if you owned property. So these four young men, because they owned property, could vote, therefore could become members of Parliament. And these four men, because they visited America together, it was sort of seen as a diplomatic mission, and they were treated with enormous respect, and they were given letters of introduction to a lot of the great politicians at the time and great families at the time. So it's very important document who they actually stayed with and who they met and who they saw, and he writes about it. So this is actually Edward Stanley's second trip. He did a grand tour in Europe when he'd literally just left Christchurch, when he was only 18. I'm sorry, when he was only 20. And his mother had died when he was 17. And he went on this grand tour when he came down from Christchurch with his uncle, George Hornby, who had been a tutor at Oxford and was 9 years older than him. So a friend, really. And they rode from Knowsley Hall, our house, to Naples. And, that's a supremely long way and an intensely physical activity. They had to avoid France, as you can see from this map, because it was just after Napoleon had, the war had ended with Napoleon. And so France was too dangerous. And even going around France, he carried a pistol when he was traveling around. And he went on horseback, and then he also went in a carriage. He was a highly sophisticated classicist, and so Rome was the ultimate goal. He wanted to see firsthand the cradle of the Renaissance and ancient Rome. And what we learn from his first journal, and I've published this in 2022, is you see some of his ideas evolving. You see his revulsion to slavery, because he saw people manacled in Venice and also in Livorno. And you see the beginning of his horror at religious intolerance. And I'll come back to that later. When he went on this grand tour, the earlier grand tours, as you know, were in sort of 1780, more that sort of time, and people went to buy art then. He didn't, as far as we know, buy art. The 10th Earl of Derby really did a great deal of the art collecting. What he did come back with was these 600 ancient Roman coins, which we recently discovered again in the archives. And it was interesting what he travelled with. He had a book in his pocket of Byron's Childe Harold, which shows he was this romantic figure, and that's where the poetry comes into it as well. So here he is. This is a picture of him when he's just leaving Eton. When you go to Eton College, which is this wonderful school just outside London, where they really do still to this day make young men the best they can be, and they're all very individual. And both my sons were lucky enough to get in there because it's very hard, and really excelled there in becoming rounded people. So as I said before, he wrote poetry in many languages, and when he was at Oxford, which he went on to after Eton, he taught himself the history of other religions and cultures. So he taught himself and educated himself in the Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim faiths when he was really studying classics. And that was certainly not on the syllabus, and shows, the empathy, the humanity, and the curiosity he had. And this really did give him an extra insight into the way of the world. So this is the map. This is his hand-drawn map of where he went. So this is folded up in the inside of the travel journals, and luckily has still survived, because the journals hadn't been opened much and probably need careful conservation at some stage. The red dots, if you can see them on this image, is where he went. So he did these blobs of where he actually went. It's probably not to scale. Why did he go to America? Very few of his peer group went. And the reason why he went is that his grandfather, the 12th Earl, was very pro-America, and he was very interested in the technological advances in America. And he said to him, go and see what's there. There was, of course, another reason why he went to America. And the other reason is because he fell in love. As well as adoring his mother and being devastated when she died, he did have this tremendous respect for women. And when he came back from Naples, he met at a coming out dance. He met Emma Caroline Bootle Wilbraham, and I always feel a tremendous affinity with her because I'm Caroline Emma, and I'm sure we've got not much in common. But I always feel that this affinity with her because of we have the same names. And he fell in love with her. He went to her coming out dance. She was a local girl. And he decided that he wanted to marry her just over that summer. And his grandfather, the 12th Earl of Derby, was very against it because he didn't think he'd seen enough of the world, even though he'd been to Naples and back. But mostly because she came from a staunch Tory family. And the family at that point were liberal. They were Whigs. And so his grandfather said, go to America, go with some friends and, cool off. And he made his grandson, Edward Stanley, promise that they would have no contact at all. And of course he said yes, because he was a dutiful young man. But love always finds a way. And he did keep in touch with her because he wrote to Lady Skelmersdale, Emma's mother. And then Emma wrote to his traveling companions because she'd met them, at the various sort of balls that were coming out then. So all the way around America, there are these letters and they kept in contact. So, it was a wonderful, wonderful love affair that continued and just became more of a love affair by the enforced banishment that he was forced to have by his grandfather. So one of the motives to go to North America was to go to Canada. And when he came back from Naples, his mentor at that time, his political mentor, was the Marquis of Lansdowne. And Bowood was this real centre of Whiggery, with an H, and liberalism. And the Marquis of Lansdowne really said to him, learn about Ireland. There's so much that's of benefit there that you can do good. So he really said to him, learn about Ireland. And he did these trips to Ireland because the family had an estate called Ballykistine, which is in County Tipperary. And when he went to North America, he wanted to visit Canada to assess the experiment and the benefits of this Irish emigration system that had been put in place to relieve poverty in Ireland, and see firsthand what it was like for an Irish family who moved to Canada. And they were actually he was actually rather shocked by how difficult it was for them to live there. They were given a certain amount of money, they were given a parcel of land, and it was very, very cold. And they couldn't always withstand these harsh winters that they had. So this is a view of Quebec, and then the next slide is also another view of Canada. And I include this next picture to show how he travelled. So the paddle steamers and steamships are really important. They gave him a time to process and think about what he saw. So when he's traveling around in Europe, he's actually just on a horse with obviously reins in his hand. And then when he gets somewhere, he's very much the young heir and, invited to everything and the opera and dances. So he doesn't have as much time to write when he's on his European grand tour. When he's in America, he spends weeks on end on these steamboats. And this gave him the time to talk, to write about what he saw. So when he was on this gap year, he regularly went hunting and caught animals to help with the kitchens. And it really afforded him the opportunity to rough it and go native, as you could see from the first slide of him. He has a stubbly beard and he's got very long hair. And when he was on this trip, he really mucked in. He chopped wood, he hewed sugarcane, he moved furniture. He also ate with everybody at the same table. And this is something which was very remarkable at the time. He would not have had that example at home. At Knowsley at that time, only men ate in the dining room. All the women, his sisters and cousins and everyone, they would have eaten in the nursery. Only the lady of the house, so his mother or his step-grandmother, would have been in the dining room. And he certainly wouldn't have eaten with his staff. But in America, when he was traveling, he ate at the same table with his staff. He had a traveling help with him and a dog called Rover, which is a very uninteresting name for a dog, but his dog was called Rover, but the dog was sent back because he found him too bumptious. He also eats with the innkeepers who host him when he's traveling around. And I include some of these pictures, these wonderful, wonderful images by Cole, just to show some of the landscape that he would have seen at that time, completely unspoilt by human hands at that time. So the other thing that's really extraordinary about his time in Canada is the amount of time he spent with the Native Americans. He manages to meet somebody called Colonel Talbot, who really knew Native Americans very well. And he spends about 6 weeks traveling with him. And because he traveled with him and met Indigenous people, he describes how they made their canoes. He describes how they lived. He describes their deportment. He is incredibly flattering about the people, and he says that these canoes were so light you could pick them up with his thumb. And then he describes how the canoes are also used as tent poles. So not only does he talk about Swiss chalet building on his grand tour in Europe, he talks about how houses and tents are made by Indigenous people in North America. Because he's such an artist and a poet, they're very visual. They're tantalizingly and fascinatingly visual. And they contain wonderful descriptions of wherever he went. And there's this extraordinary description of when he visits the Niagara Falls. And he's completely awestruck by them. And he goes behind the spray, and the deafening roar of the water is just, he's awestruck by it. And he describes sort of feeling tingling in his toes just in case, he should slip and fall, because it would have been so dangerous then. There was no health and safety rail then, for sure. Then to explain just how dangerous the conditions were that he traveled under, these are the corduroy roads, and he endured these horrendous road conditions. These were when logs were put across the road and strapped together, but of course they rotted because they had sand and mud, and if they rotted, often the wheel of the carriage would fall off, hence the middle picture and the associated drama and injuries that went with it. He also describes very amusing episodes, like the stagecoaches. Sometimes they were overcrowded, and there's a particularly funny moment where stagecoaches then apparently sat 10 and 12 tickets had been sold. And there was a a small Frenchman who didn't get a seat but was shared around between them and had to sit on their laps during the journey, which, you know, he there's no prejudice or artifice about it. He's very diplomatic, and, you know, he mucks in. But it would have been an incredibly uncomfortable journey. And when you know that he lived in Knowsley Hall and grew up in that incredibly comfortable background, it's extraordinary that he had this quest for adventure and this resilience to travel such a long way. So when they're in America, they have a ringside seat of American politics because they are these four diplomats. Really, it's seen as a diplomatic trip. They're four members of parliament, and they meet. It's a who's who of America. They meet John Adams, and they have letters presented to John Adams, President John Adams, and he would have been quite old by then, but they describe the fact that he has this extraordinary deportment. And the person who's meeting John Adams before them is in fact French. And they say that he spoke beautiful French because, of course, he'd been a diplomat. And there's a very funny story about a picture of Washington behind him, and saying that Washington had very bad teeth and didn't open his mouth so much. And so John Adams said it's probably why he was a better president than me, because I opened my mouth too much. So there are lots of charming little vignettes that go on. So he was 89 actually when they met him. So the time that they were traveling around, it was actually the 50th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War. And the Marquis de Lafayette was also traveling at the same time. He was on a triumphant tour around America, having been this very famous general who had helped General Washington win the war. But Lafayette didn't keep a diary of his tour. I think one of his aides did, but it's not as vivid and as full of amusing anecdotes as well as historical details as the book that we found. So the young Englishmen were hosted by John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster, and Edward Stanley would later arrange for Webster to visit England. He was particularly impressed by John Calhoun. He considered him to be one of the greatest orators at the time. And Calhoun is considered, I think, as the father of Southern succession, and Webster was a great proponent of the Union. So you're getting a sense of just how important this trip was, because he had access to foreign diplomats and foreign politicians that he wouldn't have had access to if he hadn't travelled. And I think that's the important thing. He made this adventure so worthwhile. So their visit coincides with the presidential election of 1824, and they arrive in Washington on the eve of the announcement of the successful candidate. So as a politician, as I've said, he was very interested in the whole political process and what could be learned. And this is an image of canvassing in that time. And of course, it's obvious here that there are no women, because women didn't have the vote then, and obviously didn't for many years later. But what he did learn from this is that men who rented property could vote, as well as people who owned property. And in England at that time, it was only people who could own property who could have the vote. So they saw the announcement of the result of the presidential election when they were actually in the House of Representatives. And there's a very amusing description that he thought that the House of Representatives was rather dirty, which is not to be disparaging. It's just a description, but, you get that level of detail. So the presidential election of 1824 was the election that Andrew Jackson dubbed the corrupt bargain. He thought it was a rigged election because he considered that the other three candidates sort of clubbed together to keep him out. And when you look at this map these are the four candidates. When you look at this map, you can see how the election wasn't really completely clear. And you see that Jackson did, in fact, have 38% of the votes there. Nobody had the clear 51%. But it's very interesting that, he comments that it wasn't a fair election. So it was clear that, on the grounds of this, that Jackson won the popular vote because he didn't have a high enough proportion of the Electoral College to be a clear winner. And therefore, the decision was reverted to the House of Representatives. But when they're there, they meet everybody. They meet James Monroe. They attended the party of the outgoing president, of James Monroe. And they also, when they're there, they describe meeting Andrew Jackson at the leaving party. And there's a wonderful description by Edward Stanley saying that he thought that Andrew Jackson behaved with real dignity on hearing the news of his defeat, which he says that he was his demeanor was really quite humble about it and understanding, and I'm sure he was seething about it despite all that, but he put on a brave face. And he describes John Quincy Adams, even though they had a similar background, he never really liked Quincy Adams. He describes him as his eyes were watering. He actually took an instant dislike to him, and he said that John Quincy Adams didn't look him in the eye, and he felt that he couldn't trust him. He just had this idea that he was untrustworthy. And, he gives these impressions, he gives these very personal impressions of what he feels about people and events in these diaries. So, as well as it being a day-to-day diary, there are also themes that he embellishes on while he's traveling around. And many of these issues in this journal are the focus of present-day historians and politicians. And really, there could, I say in a very humble way, a lot could be learned from his deliberations. He was very ahead of his time in considering race, money, privilege, color apartheid. He talks about the conditions of slave, race, and anti-slavery in America. And he notes that racial views are no better in the North than the South. And he condemns the racism that's actually behind slavery, which is very far ahead of his time. So Stanley wrote that slavery was a stain on humanity, and he was horrified in the trade of human flesh and the conditions that the enslaved people were kept in, and he writes about that. He was particularly shocked that black enslaved women were forced to do hard labor in the fields at the same time as bear children. and that every successive year they were encouraged, stroke forced to have a child. And this was after the international trade in slavery was abolished in 1806. And because of what he saw in these plantations, he then translated back into his ministries because he had this actual first-hand image of what happened. And even though he was being hosted by plantation owners, and he was polite to them and deferential to them, he did not condone slavery. So as I've said, he meets Native Americans and he paints a very sympathetic portrait of them as individuals, their manners, behavior, their agriculture, and their culture. And these are two of the Native Americans he actually personally meets. He meets Elizabeth Brandt Carr and also Corn Planter. And he says about Elizabeth Brandt Carr that she was very beautiful and had an amazing deportment and could have been a Victorian society hostess. Another theme in these journals is his preoccupation with the importance of education to social mobility. He obviously was very lucky. He had a tremendous education. He was very lucky, learnt at home, went to Eton, Christchurch University. And then when he was traveling around in Europe, he talks about academic rigor because he sees some rather undisciplined students in Germany. And he really does feel that education is the route to all social mobility. He visits universities in Transylvania and also Harvard. And when he's there, he meets a lot of, the key professors at the time, George Tinkner, Edward Everett. And interestingly enough, both of those had studied in Germany. So they would have had quite a lot to talk about because he also met professors in Germany. There's also a literary impact to these travel journals. When he was going around Canada with Colonel Talbot, he also runs into a young man called James Fenimore Cooper, and they spend a bit of time together and they, have a lot of fun together, but they are absolutely enchanted by the scenery. And because of how beautiful the scenery is when they're going around Lake Erie and Lake George, Stanley persuades young James Fenimore Cooper to write a novel. And that novel is The Last of the Mohicans. And if you look in the frontispiece of that, it's actually dedicated to Stanley, and that has been confirmed by his daughter. Another literary impact of these travels is the connection with Charles Dickens, which is something that we've only just discovered. But during these last 4 years, when I've been working on this project, I've really enjoyed discussing it with lots of other colleagues. And we had a professor, Professor Jeannie Grant Moore, staying 2 summers ago, and we were talking about the route that Stanley had taken. And she teaches, or used to teach, in Oshkosh University. And she said, this is really fascinating because it's exactly the same journey that Charles Dickens went when he went in 1842. And we put the map of where Charles Dickens went over the map where Stanley went, and it was totally aligned. So she started digging around. She said they must have known each other, or he must have advised him. So Dickens was 20 years younger. And from various researches she made, she discovered that they did in fact meet because Stanley, when he became colonial secretary and chief secretary to Ireland and prime minister, his speeches were transcribed by scribes when he was giving them in Parliament. And there was one very long speech he did, which was 6 hours. And a scribe could only write for 2 hours at a time before they got writer's cramp, I think. And one particularly long speech, Derby liked the first bit and the last bit, but not the middle bit. So he asked the scribe who'd done the first and the third tranche to come to Derby House, and he said he'd like him to do the middle bit. So Derby went through the whole 6-hour speech again, including banging on the table, you know, when he was getting wound up about various issues that he was talking about. And so this young scribe did the middle section and didn't have to write for the first and the third bit. And that young scribe was Charles Dickens. So they actually met when he was only 21. And I wouldn't say they became friends, but they obviously there was a mentoring going on. And he did, in fact, tell him to go on this trip. And then Derby told Dickens to go on that trip. And then as a literary deference to him, he wrote Martin Chuzzlewit, the novel, based on Derby's experience of going to America because his grandfather said that he should go and cool himself off. So Martin Chuzzlewit, as you may remember, he was sent to America too by his grandfather and travelled around for the same reason. So there is this, you know, tremendous literary impact. And the last thing he did was Derby, when he was Prime Minister, he translated Homer's Iliad into rhyming verse in his spare time. So not just translated it, but rhyming verse. But of course, the most important impact of this whole journey was Stanley's political legacy. It inspired latent ideas in him that he later translated into his ministries when he was Chief Secretary to Ireland, Colonial Secretary and Prime Minister 3 times to Queen Victoria. And he was the longest serving leader of any Conservative Party, 22 years. And he was minister 3 times to Queen Victoria in 1852, 1858-9, and finally in 1866-9. And he was the guiding hand behind reforming Parliament and the Second Reform Act, which doubled the British electorate overnight to include men who rented but didn't own property. And there's lots of material in this book that is so relevant to politics nowadays. And interestingly, in the appendix, he also talks about tariffs. And in 1824, he discusses the fact that there's a new American tariff, which is something that the readers might find interesting. So with his interest in education and what he saw in Canada, he also passed the Irish Education Act in 1832 because he'd been so impressed by the universal education in Massachusetts. He put in free, non-denominational primary education in every parish in Ireland in the 1831 Act, after seeing how successful unsegregated education was in Quebec. You know, he thought that if children played together, they would learn to live together and hopefully not have divisions. And that wonderful, wonderful idea of dialogue, not division, was really one of the most important things that he carried with him through his life. So, as I've said, you know, Stanley felt that slavery was the root of all evils and infected every part of the system like poison. In 1833, he after he came back from America, he became colonial secretary, and he led the debate on the Slavery Abolition Act as a direct result of his visits to plantations in America. I should add that the British weren't completely innocent either, because they had slavery in the colonies right up to then. But he never went to the colonies of the British Empire, never went to Jamaica or Barbados. But because he'd seen the conditions of enslaved people in America, it motivated him to do something about it. And from his scribblings, as I've said in the notebooks, he works out the commerciality of slavery, and it's Darby himself who takes out this big loan from the Treasury, and he works out per capita head exactly how much each planter should be reimbursed for the enslaved people who he's going to give freedom to. So he's responsible for negotiating the slaves' actual freedom in the colonies. But he does also realize that they would have had nowhere to live and obviously no job and very little education. So they would have been high and dry. So he puts in a sort of apprentice system so that they have something to do when they are free. Effectively, they carried on working for the planters, but they had some security because of this apprentice system that he put in place. So he really loathed religious persecution, and that is because he had studied from the age of 20 all these faiths. As I said before, Judaism, Hindu, and Muslim faiths, as well as being very much a Protestant. He was also a huge, huge supporter of Catholics. So he felt that everybody had something to learn from the scriptures, and he liked comparing the scriptures. And as I said before, his mother read him the Bible every night. We see very early on his revulsion for religious intolerance when he's on his European grand tour. He goes to Rome and he sees this annual ritual, which he is really revolted by. He sees the fact that Jewish people are forced to parade to the papal state, to thank the papal state every year for their freedom. And he writes that it's demeaning. He writes that actual word. And, you know, as a 20-year-old to actually feel that was such a strong, you know, gut reaction. And this feeling stayed with him, and it motivated him to pass the Jewish Relief Act in 1858, which was an act that relieved practicing Jews from denying their religion when they swore their allegiance, taking up their seats in Parliament. So if a practicing Jewish person was made a member of Parliament, they had to put their hand on the Bible to swear allegiance to the monarch as head of the church. And that was effectively denying their faith. And so some of them didn't want to do that. And so in 1858, when the Jewish Relief Act was passed, Lionel de Rothschild was the first politician to benefit from this bill. And he had been voted in twice, but he'd never taken up his seat because he didn't want to go through that. He didn't want to go through that ceremony. So I hope you've found these journals as interesting as I've found them. I mean, it's really a privilege to share these journals with the world, because they show a young man who had such a strong faith balanced with religious tolerance, and he traveled extensively in the new and the old world. He absorbed what he saw, and then he came back and made his world a better place in his lifetime. Huskisson at the time wrote of him, he was the hope of the nation. And as a young man, I in turn hope that his convictions and example might become a beacon to the next generation. Thank you for listening.
Goodness gracious, Lady Darby, that was enlightening is the word I would say. We certainly need him right here, right now. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I'd like to mention. On May 13th, our own Ron McClure will present an online lecture about English immigration to the American colonies. On May 28th, Margaret Talcott will host Matthew Lockwood for an online author event about his new book, Explorers: A New History. And then finally, on June 20th, I will be giving an online presentation entitled, modestly enough, Curt's Cabinet of Curiosities, a journey through his favorite art, architecture, and memorabilia. You can find more information about all of these events at americanancestors.org/events. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type them into the query panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have. And I'm going to start off with a question that I love hearing the answer to. When was that loan paid off, Lady Darby, that he borrowed the money for to reimburse the planters for their slaves?
It's a really interesting fact. It was only paid off in 2015. So considering that loan was taken out in 1833, it's very humbling to work out what our grandchildren are going to have to pay for COVID, because
Mm.
that's going to be a long debt too. This is what we've saddled on our children, and that's what he didn't necessarily think it was the right thing to do, but he felt it unlocked a situation, and he felt it was worth it. He felt taking out that loan was worth it to give the people their freedom.
I've thought about this a lot because people criticize the fact that the British government borrowed money to pay off owners of enslaved people, but I don't know any other way to get around that without a revolution. Because if you forced people to give up their property, mainly these people who were in control of the government and sat in parliament, it would be a bloody revolution. And this to me is the only way that keeps all parties relatively satisfied. The planters get money for property they had, the people get their freedom. And yes, it takes over 100 years to pay off the loan, but it keeps the peace and allows society to move forward, I think.
Yes, well, there's an interesting fact that when he took out this loan, he gave 800,000 people their freedom, and then unfortunately, if you look at the American Civil War, 700,000 people died
Yes.
in that. So there was no bloodshed because he did that. Maybe Abraham Lincoln would have done the same.
Um,
That's one of the great what ifs.
Yeah, very interesting speculation. And actually, speaking of slavery, how was the international slave trade abolished in 1806? I mean, who facilitated that? Was it the British government? Was it a worldwide agreement?
Well, it was Wilberforce, and he abolished the international trade in slaves. But it was also abolished in New Orleans at roughly the same time in 1807. But of course, what it did do is it meant that you couldn't produce more slaves, enslaved people. You had to reproduce them. So that's when the domestic trade in slaves became rather sinister.
Indeed. Can you tell us what a wig was?
Yes, a Whig was, it's a very, they were just liberal. The Conservatives then were conservative, and the liberals were, they had a role in advancing Catholic emancipation. But he actually later became conservative because he became increasingly uncomfortable with what he saw as the radical Whig policies. And he was not completely happy with the 1832 Constitutional Reform Act. It was moving too quickly for him then. But he felt that the world couldn't stand still, so it had to be reformed, managed, changed. And of course, when he changed from being a Whig to a Conservative, there were more people, and he could make the difference because he became head of the party.
Right. Well, since you're on the what is section, what is a Wickamist?
Oh, a Wickhamist, sorry. Yeah, we're divided by a common language. A Wickhamist is someone who went to Winchester. An Etonian is someone who went to Eton. So it's just the name of the school, the
Yes, and
person who went there.
so everybody American listening, Winchester College is even though it has the word college, it is not a university as we think of them today in America. It's basically like a prep school. As is, um, a great question here. Why was Knowsley Hall truncated?
Um, I think probably finance, but also the Second World War. So in 18, so our forebears got married in 1958. No, 48, sorry. They got married in 1948 and they didn't have any children. So they were rattling around in that big old house, this big old house. And I think it was just unmanageable. There were 8 libraries. Unfortunately, they sold some of the books. And so they just lopped off an acre and a half of Victorian wing, which happened to be the libraries, which was a lot of the books that 13th and 14th Earl collected. I mean, we're still incredibly lucky. We still have lots of books, which I'm sitting in my sitting room at Knowsley Hall, and it's just wall to ceiling books. So we're still very lucky, but there were 8 libraries before.
And did you not tell me once that at one point before these reductions that Knowsley was the fifth largest house in England?
It sounds like I was boasting there, Curt. I'm so sorry.
Well, I
Um,
love that fact.
it was pretty big, yes.
And we just have a question just popped in actually about Knowsley. When did the Darbys actually gain the Knowsley Hall estate, and what was the catalyst, financial or otherwise?
Right. Okay. At the Knowsley estate, probably Lady Margaret Beaufort. So Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the first Countess of Derby, was one of the great heiresses of her time, and she married Thomas Stanley, and brought with her, I mean, enormous estates. And she, you couldn't obviously run your own affairs until you were married then, and she had been widowed twice actually, by Edmund Tudor and also Stafford. So getting married was a way of being able to administer your own estates, and she brought her estates to Thomas Stanley, and also to bring the power to bring Henry Tudor, who was her son from France, back to England to try and fight the Battle of Bosworth, the last war of the Roses, which they won. So I'm really, the Darbys really hit the scene, shall we say, at the end of the Wars of the Roses, when Richard III was killed and Henry Tudor, who was stepson of Thomas Stanley, was made King Henry the Seventh on the Battle of Bosworth. And in return, King Henry the Seventh crowned Thomas Stanley first Earl of Derby.
Interesting questions here. Melissa asks, what was the cartoon appearing on the side with the 12th Earl and Emma?
Oh, I love that picture. That is actually of Eliza Farren. That's written there. That's not Emma Bootle Wilbraham, so I'm sorry about that. And that's them at Christie's looking at pictures, and it's of the 12th Earl, who was not as tubby and as short as that, but Eliza Farren was very, very elegant and tall, as you'll see from the picture in the Met, the painting in the Met by Thomas Lawrence.
Gareth says, knowing that Liverpool was the very first overseas consulate to be established in the United States, is there any evidence to suggest that this might have influenced Lord Derby to travel to America? And also, did he reciprocate any of his U.S. hospitality at Knowsley Hall after his return?
Yes, he did. So I actually don't know the answer to that question, whether they went because it was the consulate. I've always understood that it was because his grandfather told him to cool his ardor by going to America. But yes, Knowsley has always been a seat for people to come and stay. It's always had this long, long history of hospitality. And
That's
as I
great.
said, Webster came over. I'd have to look at the visitors book to give you an exact example of just how many came, which is my favorite thing to do, actually, when I'm having lunch on my own. I read the visitors books because they are
Oh, that's wonderful.
they're
Somebody,
amazing.
somebody has just asked, will we ever tour Lady Darby's estate? And I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, so I'm going to have two things to say. One, we are actually going to stay at Knowsley Hall with Lady Darby this December on a tour we're doing. But I wonder if this person might mean, are we going to see something like a PowerPoint presentation of the interiors of the house? So not being sure, I think we can have a two-headed question and put the last part to you. Do you think,
Right.
could you see could you see a PowerPoint or a video presentation that we could put online showing the beauties of Knowsley Hall?
Well, I've done a podcast, as you know, so that's under the Countess of Derby, and that's on Spotify. I would be delighted to do make that a visual presentation. I could do that very easily.
I think
Um,
that would
I,
be wonderful.
I haven't done that yet. Stephen Lloyd, our curator, as you know, he was hosted by you and did a webinar of the architectural history and the complications of the architectural history of Knowsley Hall. But now that this book is published, I'm not looking for other projects because I've certainly got some, but I will be doing more presentations. I'm pretty involved with the American 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, because I think I may have told you I'm Cornwallis's direct descendant.
Indeed.
So I'm doing some work on the Cornwallis sword at the moment, and I've found some really interesting discoveries in the Society of Cincinnati Library. So I'm about to share that.
That's fantastic. And also, everybody who's listening, you will get a follow-up email from Ginevra that will contain a number of things, a link where you can buy Lady Darby's book, and also information on her website and her podcast, so you can follow up on those as well. That is, unfortunately, all the time we have for questions. If you have any other questions, you can always email us at heritagetours@americanancestors.org, and we can forward on your request to Lady Darby. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. I want to thank Lady Darby, and I want everybody to stay safe, stay healthy, and hope for enlightenment as we go forward in the future. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye. Thank you so much, Curt. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and all your listeners. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.